Bias and ethics in AI. I think it's a little bit of an interesting topic. Most people have been kind of interested in this for a little while. It's on the top of everyone's minds, and I think we're going to have a little bit of a fun adventure through this today. I'll take you through, well, first of all, who I am. I work for a company, pathcom.com. It's a data center ISP. We deal with ITO. And a fair bit of the job that I have is actually automating a lot of things that people work with. So if you've been to a gas station, you've used any home consumer devices, you work with banks, probably you've encountered one or more of the services that we've used. So in a strange way, a lot of my job is automating things and putting people out of work, unpopular as that sounds. The second part of my job is I'm also the CTO of a company called Elastic Care. And it's a mobile cardiac monitoring system, and it's AI driven. And again, this is trying to deal with a problem that's really big in the world, which is healthcare. And, strange stat over here, kind of for every 1% change in unemployment, up to about 4,000 people end up dying. And that's not a good stat. So on one hand, we've got automation that's making people lose their jobs. And on the other hand, you've got people falling sick. So people are wondering why these two careers. Now you kind of know. So my background actually comes out of computer science and mathematics. I came out of the University of Toronto via Cornell and then back here. And then eventually I kind of jumped into industry because there's a lot to be done with data these days. And the entire conference is exactly about that. But ethics is something that really we should be discussing because it's not something that has a really good, easy, right answer. And it's easy to say, okay, well, you're taking the wrong answer, especially when we're starting to look at big companies out there these days. It's very easy to say someone's doing a good or a bad job, but there are a lot of subtleties. And so the entire point of today is to talk a little bit about the product journey, what we're doing in terms of science, and then also what should we be thinking about as citizens. Because at the end of the day, we're going to have to go home, live with the results of the decisions that we make, and we're also consumers. So what are some of the issues that come up over here? So we start with a little bit of a product purpose. Most of us here end up working for some kind of organization that is looking at automation, that is looking at AI, but in its truest sense, we're not going to be designing something that's at the level of Google or what Facebook and all these guys are doing right now. You're probably trying to figure out some basic patterns in terms of the data that you have, how to save money or make money. And truly, the best value that you will have to the organization is once you take the model and you ended up putting it out there in the real world and your company ends up making or saving money as a consequence. So at the end of the day, you're going to have a product traceability. But in terms of product design principles, there's a few of them. You want it to be surprising, yet familiar and delightful. If you give something that's way too left field and unfamiliar, people won't be able to relate to it. On the other hand, it also is a reduction in resource expenditures, just a fancy way of saying make people's lives easy. If you can use AI to do that, to help lower the mental, kind of the cognitive burden, help make my decisions easier, well, you're doing a good job in terms of that. Can you automate something? Can you have my pizza delivered on time before I even know I want a pizza? Okay, then you're doing a good job for me and I can relate to that product. Now these kind of things are all AI driven behind the scenes. And the other part of it is I think people need to know about is that this progression is going to be inevitable. If you don't do it, someone else will. And there's also a lot of the products that you're using today to an increasing amount are going to be automated. And so today we'll look at, for example, how some of the choices that you think you're making aren't really your choices. They're also choices that have been made for you. Okay, so today we'll talk about a lot of examples, a little bit of examples from design thinking. I know it's this big new thing, but basically it comes down to empathy and human understanding. Talk a little bit about the bigger picture, what consequences are. And again, like I mentioned before, there's no real magic bullets to any of this stuff, right? So I'm not gonna, kind of make any promises to say there's some great solutions that we have out here, but these are great thinking points, okay? Start off with a little bit about a compass. In terms of moral and ethical compasses, when we look at companies here, again, very easy to say, well, Facebook was bad, Google was good, Microsoft doesn't know what they're doing. It's easy to say these statements, but remember, these are large public companies, they have an obligation to their stakeholders, they're also trying to make their way in the world. I'm not an apologist for them, but keep in mind there are a whole bunch of subtleties behind them. That being said, how you calibrate your moral compass and your ethical compass when you're automating or working on something is not going to be the same as someone else's. It's not going to be aligned to the same true north as mine. It doesn't make you and I right or wrong compared to each other. We're just different. But if we can explain that to one another, then we can probably have the beginnings of a dialogue. Okay? So a little bit of a historical treat on this thing. We start off with as cavemen, we start off with levers. We try and figure out what to do. Well, a wheel is a class 1 lever that can help reduce the burden of moving things from one place to another. Well, that's certainly very helpful. Okay, then we start to figure out how to delegate things off and have division of labor with one another. That allows us to scale. But I think we're at this point, kind of at a turning point. It's no longer a lever from the physical perspective. We're actually starting to use cognitive and decision-based levers at this point. So now who has the accountability on that side? Again, no right or wrong, just letting you know. So in terms of phases, we can think of these as leverage, delegation, and to a fair extent, actually, I think it's fair to say abdication. Because you're actually saying, I no longer necessarily have to think about what I'm doing. The machine's going to think about it for me. Well, the machine might mimic what you're doing based on data that you fed it, which may not be complete, but you've allowed that to start making decisions for you. In terms of the benefits of each one of them, I think the first two are pretty obvious. The type of weak automation and AI that we're using today, it's great. We're making our way to be able to find cures for diseases, cancer therapies. There's a whole bunch of things that have become automated. Shopping is a lot easier these days in terms of finding tools and solutions to crunch through whole multi-dimensional data. Beautiful, no problem. But when we start to become prescriptive about certain things without understanding the variables, there are certain burdens from a moral and an ethical side that we certainly need to think about. Okay, so take that away. There's a little bit of a risk gradient over here. And the higher the reward, certainly the higher the risk that's going to come in here. So today's focus, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the abdication side. I'm not going to talk about all the great things that are already happening and the companies out there are doing, but I'm going to start asking each one of you to ask questions about what your role is in terms of AI and automation and the ethics behind it. So I might come off as a little bit of a killjoy. Sorry to say that, but the other side of the argument also deserves a little bit of attention. It's not meant to be pessimistic. It is what it is, but we'll look at this as a little bit of an evolutionary progress, and we'll talk about that towards the end. Okay? So put another way, we start to outsource a little bit of our hands and feet over here, but now this is what we're outsourcing. A little of our brain. It's no longer help me get somewhere faster, it's help me think. But what are we doing? Gone from using levers and delegates, and we've actually acquired new senses. We've allowed ourselves to see in different spectra. We can perceive of multiple dimensions and variables. That allows us to gain insight into a lot of data. However, now when you start to outsource judgment, what are the obligations that we have as scientists and product developers? Well, we'll talk about that in a second, but essentially it comes down to a matter of, is it outsourcing or is it evolution? I think it's a little bit of both. So, a little bit of Desiderata, fancy way of just saying these are the things that you probably want to have when you're talking about moral and ethical systems within AI, especially when you're doing automation. Some of them are these keywords like ethical, purposeful, explainable, fair, to whom? Equitable. Are you talking about equity of opportunity or are you talking about equality of outcome? These are not easy questions, but again, we have to start thinking about that. Explainability is also a very big one. Explainability doesn't come easily because you've got to be able to unwrap some massive neural network. How are you going to talk about that? Well, you may want to talk about it in terms of its boundary conditions. Okay, so ethics and applied AI, we take the vantage point at Pathway and at Elasticare where we say it must be generalizable beyond the individual. So it's beyond just what is good for me. It should also be beyond kind of what's good for society. Relativist, these are some of other kind of matters that come up in here. Consequentialist, meaning that we start to define our moral compasses based on the consequences and the results of something rather than walk into it with a predefined notion of it. Okay? There's a little bit of human-centric aspect to it, and some people have either a religious or a puritanical basis. And as much as we want to discount this, it really does have a place in here. Okay? Moral hazards. It's just a fancy way of saying I'm going to make a decision where I'm insured in terms of the consequences, but someone else is going to bear the burden of the results. Sounds a lot like what's happening with social networks these days. We make a lot of profit, someone else has to pay the price for it, but it's easy to kind of get away. Again, I'm going to say a bunch of things that are going to probably be severely career limiting for me. If it's going to be career limiting for you, I'm sorry. Start off with ask why. Basically, what are you trying to optimize over here? What type of product are you creating? What is your purpose in terms of a product? Are you trying to expedite? You're trying to get someone's coffee faster? You're trying to get them to a destination faster? Are you trying to educate them? Well, let's use a simple example here. I like this one, and I'm actually going to give credit to Stuart Russell, great professor out of Southern California. He talks about, getting your coffee. So I say, okay, Alexandra, rather than saying the name of a company which I don't want to get sued for, please make me a coffee. And so the machine says, okay, and it goes through my kitchen and it runs over my cat in the process. Alternatively, it could also turn me into a coffee because it didn't understand what I meant by make me a coffee was please go into the kitchen, take a bunch of beans, put it into the machine. We don't speak in well-formed formulae. We speak in kind of regular everyday lingo. But unless a machine knows my intent and has some boundaries put on it that says do no harm, it might end up doing something wrong to my poor cat, unless I tell it not to. So, if you tell it to achieve the objective at any cost, you get this little moral hazard situation arising here. Easy as it sounds, these situations arise more often than you think. And they actually arise in very large cases too. Let's take another example over here. I don't know if the colors come through or not. This actually is a picture from Abraham Walden. So he was a statistician out of kind of the First and Second World War. But this is a great example of what they talked about, the survivability of aircraft. So any ideas as to what you would say was the outcome from here that they decided? The red areas were the hits. So what do you think they should do? I think most people would say, all right, that's a pretty bad scenario. Let's make sure that we patch up the wings and the fuselage and kind of the back of the elevator over there. And if you think the same thing, congratulations, you're wrong. Mostly. Because these were the planes that made it back. If the cockpit got shot up, or if the gunner turret got shot up, you don't make it back. So we have to ask ourselves, what do you really know about the data that you're feeding into these systems to begin with? And a lot of that bias now starts to come in. What is your bias towards the data? Are you only talking about the things that you know? Are you talking about unknown knowns, known unknowns? Or the worst one is these so-called unknown unknowns. We can thank our friend Mr. Rumsfeld for popularizing this into our lexicon, but this is really important. What you feed into your systems is going to determine the efficacy and to a large extent how ethical or morally aligned your systems are going to be. So, let's use another example over here. Anyone recognize this one just by a show of hands? Who's seen this video in elementary school? Perfect. It happens to be the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, right? So in the early 1940s, this bridge, they didn't understand that this was something called aerostatic flutter. So when the wind picked up, the bridge decided to wobble pretty violently to the tune of eventually, something pretty bad ends up happening. There was a poor dog that didn't survive this, and the bridge came tumbling down. So they didn't quite know at that time what aerostatic flutter was. So again, we have to ask ourselves, what do you know? And when this eventually happened, there were a bunch of safety mechanisms and certifications that came out. Are we doing something similar for AI? Well, we can talk about ACD, Canada's got a digital charter, but enforceability is a different thing. How do you say what is a certifiably safe AI system that's aligned with our safe interests? Okay. Let's take another example over here. We say connect the world, but these days it kind of looks like this. Right? People tend to wake up this way and they go to bed this way. How many people do this? If you don't, either you're lying or you're really good people. But this is what's happening. This has effects on the way we interact with one another. You may say this is not necessarily an amoral and immoral thing, but this has impacts on the way our society behaves with one another and they interact. So purpose based on your algorithms also has consequences. There's some other examples right now. Let's say you do a Google search for engine diagram for a 1967 Mustang, and then these days you would just say, okay, fix my car. Because your way you think has started to change now. If you say engine diagram, it'll start to predict and just give you a model of it and say, would you like it fixed? We used to be able to interact. You'd go to a library, you would look up, you would learn, explore, and then you'd be able to figure out what your solution is. But these days, you scroll and swipe. You are given a bunch of options. Who determined those options to be the best? What was more? What were the unknown knowns or known unknowns? Were there more options? If I search for high pectin fruit, should I only get green apples? What will your children know about a blue apple or a red apple if all you see on the first page of your Google search happens to be this? It changes the way you perceive of choice. In terms of Parliament, if I type that in, what if it sends me this? Your Uber is here. Okay, maybe in 90% of the cases I do want to go to Parliament, but why Uber? Why not Lyft? Why not Ola? So automation, great, you're trying to make it convenient for me, but then this starts leading of issues of antitrust, choice, etc. Okay? So while you may have a noble and ethical purpose, it's actually tremendously difficult to implement these safely without starting to raise some questions. So here's some other great examples that we have within here. Healthcare, you want to save cost. Okay, well you can also end up getting admissions denied due to survivor bias. You say the people who survive most tend to be middle class, Caucasian people between the ages of 25 to 35. Well, what if you happen to be a single black mother who makes it in and you're deprioritized as a consequence over there? Again, these are cases that are already happening right now. These are not hypotheticals. In a court judge, there was a case where it decided, as a test example, to prosecute an 8-year-old girl who had opened up a lemonade stand, as an example, when they gave it the test data. You probably don't want to prosecute an 8-year-old girl who's opened up a lemonade stand. You may say, okay, it's a great algorithm that worked. Doesn't seem terribly ethical to me. It doesn't align with the society's idea of it. Time on site, you know what? Social networks are a pretty polarizing thing, but their objective is to tell you what you want to see that's familiar to you. You get entrenched in your position, and to show someone a difference means to be educated. It's not a bad thing to have difference. It's a good thing. You can have a dialogue. I believe that from my own personal standpoint, but if you start doing this, getting people entrenched, you and I don't learn from each other in the future. In terms of HR systems, there's a lot of things that have been done by, for example, IBM. We can predict when someone is going to resign. Guess what? Bob is going to resign in 3 months. Why don't you bring Bob into my office and then let's find a case about where he's messed up in the last 3 months to see if we can get him out of here. This is not a hypothetical. This is real. This is today. This is in production. Your tenure within an organization is being predicted. Okay? To a large extent, this is true. Yes, there are other factors that go in, but the algorithm and the data that you put into it will determine, for all practical intents and purposes, the ethical framework that will be the case when you put it out into the real world. The algorithm determines the ethics. So we need to think about aligning these with our desired outcomes. And in terms of AI design, we call this the value alignment problem, which is how can we make it align with our desired outcomes. So we start off with a lot of edge cases. There's a lot of contradictions. What's right and for whom? If I'm an organization that has to make or save money, if you have to pay the price for that, if I'm going to predict Bob's tenure and replace him or her with someone who's going to cost me $30,000 a year less, is that ethical? Well, I've saved my company a lot of money. That's my compass, but Bob or Jane has got to go home now without a job. Okay? So we have to be aware of algorithmic bias too. So every one of you here, I'm guessing some of you are scientists, some of you are product engineers, some of you are curious about this stuff. Your algorithms have a certain purpose. So if you're using it on a social network, are you showing what's popular? Are you showing what's anomalous? Let's take the example of, for example, spurious relationships. If I'm trying to predict, for example, whether someone is going to develop diabetes or not, and I just put into it a variable that says the number of turkey sandwiches sold in Afghanistan in 1973. Believe me, there's a theorem in statistics that says it will find you a correlation with that. Diabetes has nothing to do with the number of turkey sandwiches sold in Afghanistan in the 70s. You feed it garbage, it'll find you a pattern, and you'll be accoladed for that, but it has no practical purpose. Okay? Anyone knows what this means? Hands? No? Oh, wonderful. Okay. At first, do no harm. The second little thing in there is little Maslow's pyramid of needs, right? You talk about the physiological all the way up to the self-actualization portions of it. But from the Hippocratic Oath, we say we shall do no harm. We have to start thinking along these lines rather than just being purely algorithmic and scientific about these things. To start thinking like humans, for humans, because that's who we're designing these systems for. So in terms of risk, the more you outsource, from mechanics up to the brain, the higher the risk goes. And the greater the burden is on us as product designers, as ethicists, to be able to apply our know-how as citizens to be able to come up with better systems. Okay? So aligning requires explaining. So to yourself, to those affected, here's what the current method is, and here's what our current incentive is. I came up with a great set of algorithms. Great. What is my incentive to explain it? Not much. It's about as good as the sand in the ground. And that's very true, especially when you're talking about millions or billions of users on a system. To be totally honest, and out of no offense to everyone, we're not dealing in here with the majority of the people in this room that are going to affect billions of people. But the large systems and the products that we use do affect billions of people. And their current incentive to explain right now is almost nothing. Okay, so you have to explain to align knowns, unknowns, and a whole bunch of these things, because we want these so-called safe consequences. But we also want them to be so-called more widely ethical. What do we mean by widely? It's not limited to just you and me. So explainability also means to summarize the purpose. Maybe the obligations. What are the limitations in here? So if you're going to put a legal system in place or an HR, I have a right to face my accuser. That's one of the tenets in law. How do I face an AI-based accuser? Upon what precedent? How do I unwrap a bunch of weights in a neural network? Can you explain that to me? And you have to scale for vulnerability at risk. Here's the wonderful part about all of this. It's all completely optional right now. Let's try and explain the algo instead. Okay? Same thing. It's completely optional. You can say whether it classifies, clusters, boundary summarizes. Is there a way that you can explain to me what my legal requirements are, or what my obligations are when I go to a social network site? You can surely use AI to summarize that into a bunch of language that's accessible by a 5-year-old, by a 10-year-old. If you go there, someone is going to take your data and they might share it. That's something you could explain to a 5-year-old kid. And it is in our capability set to be able to summarize that. However, it's still completely optional. We've got to explain consequences. It's not the only choice. It may cause addictive behavior. This already happens. It may not be factual, what you're reading on there with fake news. Caveat emptor, okay? At your own hazard. We have a hard time even doing it for things like this right now. It's taken us a couple of thousand years to realize that probably these things should be outlawed. My apologies to the smokers, but not. I'm not of the belief that this is something that's good for you. But we still have a tough time passing laws in this area. And again, it remains completely optional. I love the fact that we've got these codes of ethics in there, but the consequences right now to protect against them don't have a lot of teeth. The biggest users and the people who are exploiting the loopholes in terms of our networks and these large products are unsavory individuals like this. They're one of the biggest users. They're promulgating their own hatred agenda out there, their own fascist agendas. We don't like these types of people using those, but right now it's not up to them and no one's taking the ownership. We can make Barack say anything we want because we've got these great open source tools that are doing deepfakes. Pre-crime is a reality. You're already able to do this right now. The only thing is they're just not taking action. But these are systems that are in production today. You can look at activity going on in the street based on someone's facial expression. You can find out, or at least try and predict, whether someone's going to commit a crime. Let's just outsource and figure out, oh no, I didn't make the decision, the drone did. Okay, can you explain upon what basis? No, not really. You go and talk to, some company that I outsourced to. So we pay a couple of $1 billion for that. And fake news. As much as I'd like to see this headline, I'm not sure whether I'd be able to believe everything I see. So what is a good kind of trustworthy news source? Can we use AI to make it trustworthy? Okay. So we talk about countermeasures and ideals for the Canadian Digital Charter. They're great, but we have to figure out how to make them actually enforceable and provide incentives for explainability and enforceability, that there are consequences when societally things start to go south. So you can look at it as, for example, you can make privacy a feature. Companies like Apple have started to do it as a unique value proposition. You can make it a privilege. And at some point you can say we can come up with certifications, like in the case of the bridge. You have to be certified before you build a bridge. Eventually you can make it a law. And then finally, if stuff really starts to go south, it becomes a matter of national security. Countries have already started to do this. Sri Lanka shut off its social networks and access to them in the wake of the terrorist attacks because it was a matter of national security. It's what we call our tipping points. So, countermeasures, you got to figure out how to make them profitable, feasible. You got to make them grounded and realistic, and also global versus local, and finally, deal with the inevitable, because these things are going to happen. Okay, so you can already have viruses that tend to write themselves, and if you combine it with a technology like this, by the way, these are things that are already being done. How do I know? We research these types of things today. How to take a virus that will write other viruses, or how to make a neural network write a virus that will exploit loopholes in an OS. So by comparison, what you're getting exploited by today is script kiddie stuff. The other stuff starts to go into this area, where you start combining with genetics. The scientists in China already cloned 2 girls who were immune to the HIV virus, but are, for some reason, this affected their IQ, and it has also affected their lifespan. And if we start combining this with AI, it raises interesting questions. Again, not saying it's good or bad, but is this our natural evolutionary process? So finally, we talk about consequence assessment, right? Instead of being locally kind of greedy, let's flip the fulcrum over here, right? Where you have to say it's widely consequential. And how do we get there? Well, let's take a bunch of the data and the methods. Let's take all the AIs that we have in there and the automation, put it into a blender, and use AI to find out what will it look like in terms of our society, and then incentivize the safe deployment of it. That's one solution. Because I don't want to come off as a whiner and complain and say, well, all AI is bad. Okay? So take your data, have it interact with it, make a simulator of sorts. We're already doing this for reinforcement and reverse reinforcement learning. But see what the implications would be. Because at the end of the day, we have to look at the impact of technology on the individual. So can we simulate the effects of social networks and automation? Absolutely, we can, and we should. But we should also find out how to certifiably deploy it in a manner that incentivizes the people. Okay? Use the term ethnographic evaluation. How many people have heard the word ethnography over here? It's a study of cultures. Okay? So at the end of the day, you want to take virtues, vices, the economy, and the human condition, in addition to just the capital interest. It's not just the capital imperative that you want to say, I want to maximize stakeholder interest. We should also be simulating this to find out what effects this will have. This is well within our means. Look, I'm not even one of the smartest guys out there, and I can do this. So why is it not within the interests out there of large companies to do this? But as citizens, it's incumbent upon you to raise your hand, use your voice, and say, I demand this, to make it widely consequential and to use AI. So why? Because the effects are pretty wide-ranging, okay? And you have to build for the inevitable tipping point. This doesn't come off too well, unfortunately, but let me give you a couple of examples that are in here. Google dropped out of a $10 billion Pentagon project for cloud. Facebook and Microsoft had security breaches that were 50 million people were exposed to it. So Zuckerberg's testimony, Project Maven, we've heard about. All these things are AI-driven projects, by the way. Microsoft's partnership also, by the way, they had managed to end it with ICE. So the immigration officials down in the States were identifying people and being able to, preemptively kick them out of the country. Now you may say this is great for Microsoft, you're making a lot of profit, but realize that these are the real life implications that are being had in the world right now. And when you're investing in this, you should find out where's your money invested, where your stock's kept right now, because you're currently investing in this right now. Again, I don't judge it. I should say you should be aware. Okay? So what? At the end of the day, you want to have a meaningful redeployment of labor. We are ultimately going to be outsourced in whatever we're doing right now. If anyone in here hasn't already been outsourced, moved, or fired, it's a matter of time. We're at that point. It's happened to me. And if it hasn't happened to you yet, please be prepared for it. I will warn you, it is going to happen. You have to figure out how to deal with monopolies and monopsonies. Monopsonies are things that are single purchaser. If you want to sell something, eBay or Kijiji, they will buy it. Are there any other choices? Not really. But figure out how to combine empathy with EBITDA. Okay? Consequences and free will. And you also have to ask yourself, in terms of the larger scale, is this really our evolutionary process as human beings? Is it our evolutionary fate to just abdicate even our judgment? Because as organisms, we want to be at a state of rest to minimize the energy expenditure that we have. So if we've come up with this mechanism of artificial intelligence to which we can just abdicate our decision-making capability, is that a natural evolutionary process? Maybe. It could completely be valid. I don't know. The evidence seems to point to that. So we don't really look at it as, well, human beings are going to be usurped by it, and it actually knows our nutritional needs. But what will we do for meaningful employment? but it raises issues of what your societal structures are going to be like. What does meaningful employment mean? Well, we can't all sit at home and be philosophers. What are we going to do? What are your children and grandchildren going to do? Are you going to have a single large company that just runs everything and tells you what the point of truth is going to be? Okay, not bad. However, are you going to be exposed to the full range of options available? Is a green apple the only apple you have available? Okay. Everyone's seen a picture of this. Happens to be a black hole. I think this is a great metaphor. Everyone talks about the singularity and about the convergence of AI. What you see around the little disk is what they call the accretion disk over there. All that matter kind of gets scrunched up and there's a lot of heat. We look at that from an economical perspective. You're starting to see a lot of heat going on with a few big companies, and everything on the outside is starting to begin to converge. We call that consolidation. And at the end of it, with a black hole, the thing about that event horizon is you cannot see beyond that. Evolutionarily, it's like asking an ant to perceive the surface of, for example, 3 dimensions. All it knows is a flat surface. Intrinsically, it cannot perceive in 3 dimensions. It just knows a flat world. Maybe from our perspective, all we know is a flat world. We can't see beyond that curtain of the event horizon in terms of automation because perhaps we are not meant to do that. We're not evolved enough yet. But perhaps that is our natural trajectory to go towards this in terms of an evolutionary cycle. So from the macro scale, we shouldn't necessarily judge it as being a good or a bad thing. It perhaps is just the process to which we're meant to evolve ultimately one day. And in terms of a singularity, this isn't one. We've had many before. Organisms didn't have eyes before, they didn't have ears, they didn't have different senses. Well, there's a multiple singularities along the way. And that's the entire process of evolution. So from the grand scale of things and the thousands and millions of years, maybe this is just the next singularity. Either we have to adopt new senses or ways of thinking, and until then, we should just try and figure out a safe way to be able to get there together. So I would leave you with the remark to just say, ask questions of the world around you. Ask about the choices that you make. Ask about what you're consuming, and ask about what you're learning. And it's not necessary to say whether it's good or bad, but just to put your hand up and say, I'd like more choice, and I'd like you to explain to me what this impacts in terms of myself, in terms of the people around me. Thank you for your time. Questions, comments? Yes, ma'am. So how long has our company been around? So Pathway's been around for about 20 years. Elasticare, we're in our 3rd year. It's a startup right now for the medical industry. So remote cardiac monitoring is what it's doing right now. So the company is basically, we're looking at cardiovascular disease, but it's a growing problem, and I think also related to just the stats in the world. People are getting older, sicker. So we're trying to take something that's kind of an inevitability in healthcare and just trying to automate a whole bunch of that. So trying to take something that's typically a 6-month diagnosis time and bring it down to, ideally something like 6 days. So, yes, ma'am.
Being someone who studied philosophy as a major, how do we use that as well as business to integrate with each other? We keep talking about this in terms of the ethos of businesses and AI, but what can businesses actually do in order to ensure that we're being good stewards of this information and data?
It's a great question. I mean, you as a philosophy major, you'd know that. Yeah, so you're asking how do you take into account, so you happen to be a philosophy major, what is the place, how do you understand and incorporate the ethos of what of philosophy, and how do you apply it to the business world, if I understand your question. I don't know what the easy answer to that is, but I do think we need to have more psychologists, more product designers, more philosophers in businesses today, now more than ever before, because these types of questions about consequentialism, utilitarianism, whether you're talking about being, puritanicalism, whether you're studying Aquinas or Hobbes, or, I minored in Phil myself. So, I mean, these things certainly inform my choices and, my career as a product designer. And I rely more, frankly, on psychology and philosophy today than I ever do in trying to figure out what, if I should use ReLU or whether I should use, basically just a sigmoid, activation function these days. I spend more time thinking about those things. But I'm not sure whether all companies have, jumped onto that bandwagon just yet. That's really where the design thinking component, I think, needs to come in, more so than the technical component of it. So I think the enlightened organizations incorporate a design thinking component, and they'll tend to be much more empathetic and last longer. Apple Lexus, I mean, like some of the great brands, Ritz-Carlton, you know, those are great empathetic brands where they've taken design thinking and philosophy into account. So, I mean, there are great examples of companies out there that have taken that approach. So.
There's some self-regulation happening already in the industry. Do you think, or typically it's the government who does that, do you think it should fall under the portfolio of the, let's say, the Privacy Commissioner in Canada?
So the question is about, there are a lot of companies that self-regulate right now, and whether this should fall under the, you know, kind of the purview of the Privacy Commissioner. Self-regulation is difficult because you'll end up having a basically stakeholder imperative. You got to make. The easy answer is, I don't think, it's like trying to mark your own test. You're always going to give yourself 100%. And even when it's the law, even when elections get changed, people still don't enforce anything, right? I mean, you can just end up taking your company and registering it in the Isle of Man and you're fine. So it's a matter of enforceability, you know, if it starts changing certain characteristics, and how do you detect whether societal shifts in terms of democracy or in terms of your water and your utility systems have been penetrated and being adversely affected or starting to occur. The problem is also, I think, this is a boil the frog problem. It's not something that happens like this. And it's easy to just kind of go down that route and you say, well, it doesn't really need to be enforced because nothing major has happened. But the problem, the same thing with a black hole, is you're inside it before you even know it. And after a certain point, when you cross the event horizon, you know what happens? You can't get out. But you don't really know you've crossed it. So similarly, that's why we have a hard time enforcing it. That's why I think the black hole analogy is a really, really great one. You slide into it, before you know it, you can't crawl out of that cliff. So I don't know what the easy answer is, but I think in terms of having a grassroots approach, it begins with citizenry, I think, at the end of the day. Yeah, it needs to but citizens determine the government. You know, when we say the US Constitution, we the people, it has to start with the people. Sir, question?
It's almost the same thing. 200 years ago, someone had said it's not a good idea to put sugar in everything. They may have thought, hey, you're right, it's not that healthy. At the time, businesses in charge of it said, no, we put sugar in it, people buy more, we make more money.
Sure.
We've got the exact same problem now. We've got AI to take away your choices, reduce your options, make you think you made a great choice. It makes us money. So given that we can't allow them to self-regulate, because we know, historically, they're going to choose the path of least resistance.
And it's not all bad news. I mean, there's some great consequences that have happened from automation, and it's not all horrible. We have to realize that. We have to put it in perspective. But when are we outsourcing this and this versus outsourcing this? I think that's the question, right? It's really about focusing on this part of it, as opposed to trying to figure out whether it's a force multiplier or a lever that we're outsourcing, or are we outsourcing our judgment at the end of the day? So there's certainly good aspects to it, but I mean, at one point they were prescribing cigarettes to pregnant women, right? In the 1950s. And they used data to support their hypothesis when we knew it was bad. So, hey, I'll jump off. If there's any more questions, I'm happy to answer them offline. Again, thank you for your time.